All right. Hi, this is Paul Poirier, and welcome to the 5 Factors of Good Building, Why Changing Product Specification is Necessary to Save the World. I'd like to thank our monthly sponsor, Amon Parker Insurance, and thanks to our COAT committee sponsor, Hayward Lumber. And thank you to our sponsor for this presentation, 475 High Performance Building Supply. So I'd like to introduce Lucas Johnson, a former Santa Barbara local, very involved with the AIA, the USGBC chapter, used to be called C4, now called the Central Coast Green Building Council, the Sustainability Project. You work with Dennis Allen. I see Dennis there. So one of your alumni, Dennis, to come back to Santa Barbara to share the stuff he's learned on his life journey. Lucas holds degrees in physiochemical biology, environmental science, and business management. He's contributed as a scientist, builder, utility program manager, and material supplier to deliver over 10,000 high-performance building projects ranging from deep energy retrofits of large commercial buildings to net zero passive houses with natural materials. He began his work to reduce our collective carbon impact, but now focuses equally on resilience to a changing climate, while pushing for the right to comfortable, healthy, and affordable homes as a core element of social justice. The uniting theme of his career is to turn BS into building science. As a society, we have too long accepted less bad solutions when we can have truly good buildings for the same cost. The ingredients create the results. As a chief science nerd at Valley Homes, Lucas enjoys collaborating with homeowners, developers, architects, designers, and builders to make their projects an enjoyable and smart investment. So I'll turn it over to Lucas at this point. Great to see you again, buddy.
Thank you.
You have to give us a call when you're out on the West Coast again, but he's zooming in from Tucson, Arizona.
Indeed. Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to reconnect with an area I love dearly after spending many years of my life there. So without further ado, since we are on a tight timeline today, I will get started. Is everyone seeing that okay? Perfect. So this presentation is called The 5 Factors of Good Building. Paul, I changed it last minute from C4. I hope I got that right now. Is it CCGBC? That's right now. Perfect.
Right.
3 of my favorite organizations getting together to listen to me talk about 5 factors of good building, which is one of my favorite subjects. So that makes me a happy guy. Thank you for being here. So to start, who's Valley Homes? This is the company that I now co-run with my business partner. First and foremost, we're scientists. What we do is applied research, especially for hot climates. We do a lot of consulting work. That's the primary thing that we do, is help architects, builders, developers, et cetera, learn how to build better buildings. But we also act as developers ourselves. This is the 4-unit project we're building in Phoenix right now, with the intent for it to be the lowest carbon per square foot building ever built in Arizona. Well, other than the natural buildings that are built occasionally, those ones are absolutely incredible. I should say conventionally framed building in Phoenix. And we want to go through the pain of developing in that climate. Phoenix is like one of the hardest places I've ever had to try to get this stuff done. But by doing that, we get the applied experience to be able to help others do it better. So we push through the very painful process of development for that reason. We like to call ourselves good building activists or climate activists. We're focused on buildings as an opportunity to be not just low carbon, but actually a carbon sink for the overall world. We are concerned parents. I have 2 children now, 4 and 7. My business partner has 2 kids. They're 2 and just born 2 weeks ago, roughly. So congrats to him. He's not joining us today for that exact reason, though. When we're not doing good building, we're usually outdoors having fun in nature and appreciating that. And up until recently, I called us stoic leaders. We believe very much in business should be as enjoyable as possible, because joy scales organically. Whereas if everything's all stressful and difficult and we're pushing people and using fear to motivate, it's not really that fun. So it doesn't really draw people that naturally. But building in the current market has made us stoic-ish rather than stoic. We'll get back to stoic at some point soon. So here's my business partner, Austin. He's the founder and our details geek. And then this is me, Lucas Johnson, the chief building nerd, and currently serve as a board member at the Northwest Eco Building Guild. I used to be on the board for C4 when it was called C4 back in the day. That was my first taste of that experience, and it was just such an amazing group of people to work with, and I imagine it continues to be. So yeah, I would love to see more connection, just a brief moment to say this, between our various different nonprofit organizations in our region, because we're all doing so much similar work and with the same goals. I think there could be a lot of power in, uniting our voices or whatnot. So the big picture, I know I said we won't use fear to motivate, but I'm going to start with some scary stuff. Humanity is going to have a really rough future without some radical changes in social justice in the built environment. War is going to continue to get more and more intense as resources get more and more scarce. Increased incidence of pandemics is definitely a predicted part of climate change, and climate change itself. We're kind of towing the line on a lot of really extreme things that we're running out of time to solve. But it seems like the predictions say that if we get our butts in gear, we still have a few years left where we can make a meaningful difference. So I'd say let's do it. And with 2 young kids, I feel it's our imperative to solve these problems for the next generations. It's pretty selfish of us if we don't. And a lot of what we're doing may not be helping. I'll call myself out. When I was in Santa Barbara, I used a lot of spray foam very early and when it was popular, not understanding the life cycle health and carbon and social justice issues of using a product like that. It is tempting as far as being an easy to install air barrier and that kind of stuff. But is it durable over time? Is it fair to ask people to dress up like they work for the CDC to install a insulation product? I don't know. I kind of, over the last few years, being, decade actually now, I've really come to solidly say, no, it's not worth using products like this. And we are building a lot of certified buildings with a lot of really great intents, but a lot of these buildings aren't necessarily delivering holistically. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about about carbon in this presentation, Chris Magwood, the guy you see there with the microphone in the middle, gets a lot of credit. I knew I loved the guy the first time I saw him present this 3-minute thesis because he'd made an elephant out of carbon dioxide molecules to talk about the carbon elephant in the room. We'll get into more details about that in a bit. And then also, we just tend to myopically look at energy efficiency as a proxy for all this other good stuff. So we're building hyper efficient buildings that are generally pretty comfortable, but there's a lot of failures as far as durability, health, carbon impact from a life cycle standpoint, et cetera, that we can continue to improve. As Paul mentioned earlier in the intro, thanks again for that, Paul. The ingredients create the results. That's become the core saying of the work that I've done over the last few years as I've dug more and more into this 5 factors of good building approach. It really does come down to that. There's no magical property of design where we can design out the impact in the products that we use. Those are set ahead of time. That's just natural to what that ingredient is. For a brief summary, I'm borrowing this from my buddies at Havelock Wool. This image, I think, summarizes this concept very well. Our fibers are produced here in this happy field, in New Zealand with sheep who are well taken care of. I live a great life, but I'd also highly consider trading my life to be a sheep in New Zealand. It's a pretty sweet existence. And they're not only using good wool like that, but it's usually generally scrap wool that wasn't a revenue stream for the farmers. So it's creating extra money for people working hard to provide wool for the world. Really neat story there, right? Versus the story of, say, fiberglass insulation or spray foam insulation, where you're mixing a bunch of chemicals and fossil fuels together in giant factories that pollute local, areas as well as globally, having a lot of issues associated with those life cycles of those products. You cannot design those impacts out of a product. So sustainability is no longer about doing less harm. It's got to be about doing more good. And what are these 5 factors of good building? So there's comfort and health. There's efficiency and renewables. There's durability and resiliency. there's social equity and embodied injustice, and then there's life cycle carbon impact. There's also a lot of other factors, of course, that are important, like cost and constructability and other mission critical things like that. But these 5 factors need to be considered across the board as much as possible with every product specification, is the design philosophy that we've started using at Valley Homes. So 5 factors, what is it exactly? It's a design tool to encourage holistic decision-making. So we want people to be able to see a more complete perspective of products as they specify them. It is not a certification. Rather, it's more of a philosophical approach of rejecting less bad and demanding good products. Having that, there's not like a continuous spectrum of bad through less bad to good. It's bad through less bad is a spectrum we should avoid. And then there's good through incredibly amazing products. And that's the spectrum of products that we should be using. Guide for integrating performance measures throughout the design process. And a really important point to make, because I've never made a ton of money doing this and I still want to have a good building, is this approach works with high performance or low performance budgets. It's designed to be a much more accessible thing than, say, Passive House, which is something that I absolutely adore and love, but a lot of folks can't afford Passive House, right? So if you can't afford that, what else can you do? That's been a very interesting research question. So this is my house in Tucson that I'm speaking to you from. And what I hope to illustrate with this is that good low performance can be much better as an investment than bad high performance, right? So we wanted to do a high performance retrofit of this house, but having just bought this house, we didn't have any money to do high performance. We looked at that budget, it was $50,000 to $100,000. There's no way we could afford doing that. So what we did is, ironically, as a person who spent a lot of their career focused on insulation air tightness, this is a very leaky house that has not a speck of insulation in it, other than maybe like a sarcastic amount of insulation, you know, kind of, it looks like someone dropped some insulation in the attic at some point. But despite those features, we were very concerned about our carbon impact because of being so low performance and attached to a very high carbon impact grid. The carbon impact per kilowatt hour on the grid in Tucson is quite high because there's a lot of coal in the grid mix. So our goal was to become all electric and solar powered. There's a lot of reasons to get rid of natural gas in buildings, health being one of the main ones, carbon impact being another one. But we wanted to go all electric with our house. That was the goal. We allocated about $5,000 total. That's what our budget was. That's mostly because we needed new appliances, had to do a little bit of wiring, switched to 100% LED, did a variable speed pool pump, and then had generally low plug loads in general, right? Like we work off laptops and such. Solar, we did 0 down for 6.5 kilowatts of PV. And the results in the end is we were cash flow positive as far as the amount we pay on the solar loan is less than the savings we generate. The house is 105% net positive, 87% including charging the electric car. So we need to figure out how to boost that up a little bit. And it's a healthy house, it's durable, it's mostly comfortable, you know, without the insulation and stuff. Tucson can be a gnarly climate at times, so we do have to run the HVAC more than I'd like. And it's a very low carbon house. Do we want to make this a good high performance house eventually? Hell yeah. But we're gonna have to save up to do that. So in the meantime, we knocked off about 80 to 90% of our carbon impact so that we don't have that carbon impact building up while we save for the good retrofit. So 5 factors, what are the goals? Of the factors, these 3 you want to maximize: comfort and health, efficiency and durability. Embodied injustice, which is a term I'm borrowing from my wife's world. She's a professor of anthropology. And carbon impact are obviously things we want to minimize. So common applications we've used 5 factors on is new construction projects from tiny homes through 300 unit multifamily. Retrofits, it works for that kind of approach. But I think the most effective way to use it is by looking at individual products. I've spent the last decade or so trying to figure out how to explain efficiently to people why I no longer like spray foam insulation. 10, 15 years ago, my hypothesis was spray foam insulation is useful and worth using. I collected data, I had to reject that hypothesis. That's how, the progress of science, right? And I feel like I made some mistakes installing it. But having that conversation has historically been a really long conversation, especially with clients, right? Being the general mainstream, the public. So the way we talk about it now is that spray foam is a 16 out of 50 point product. Sure, we'll give it some credit for efficiency and stuff like that, but from a durability, a health standpoint, social justice, and a carbon standpoint, it gets very low scores. 16 is actually quite generous. I think it could be as low as 9. And even if people don't understand why this number out of 50 possible points, so there's 5 factors, 10 points per factor, you can get up to 50 points for a given product. So people in general identify as people that use at least 30 out of 50 point items. So this has made the process of this conversation incredibly efficient, because you can just ask, do you want to use a 16 out of 50 point product, or would you prefer to use something that's, say, 45 points out of 50 points? So not all wood fiber insulation is created equal. Not all wood is good. There's a lot of wood that is actually bad, that could be worse than concrete and steel. But if it's sustainable FSC, or done with cyclical forestry, made in efficient factories, et cetera, wood can very much be part of our carbon storage solution. This analysis was done specifically for the Gutex wood fiber product, and we scored it 45 out of 50 points. Nothing's perfect, but Gutex is getting up there. That's more what I'd want to use, is a 45 out of 50 point product. So who's tried this? We've worked with developers, homeowners, builders, architects. We've been getting a lot of feedback about it. And again, it's more of a design philosophy than it is necessarily a design tool. There's a whole formal spreadsheet with a weighted average system with over 220 points of performance that we look at kind of in the back end, but we don't find it that effective to get everyone else involved in that part of the conversation. It's really the score out of 50 points that is most effective in talking about these things. So to summarize again, this is the 5 factors of good building: comfort and health, efficiency and renewables, durability and resiliency, social equity, embodied injustice, and life cycle carbon impact. Now let's dig into these factors a little bit. So step 1, require healthy ingredients, right? This is me at our Muse project in Phoenix, that 4-unit one I showed you on the second slide, pointing at some wood fiber insulation that we're going to be wrapping our buildings with. We have to acknowledge that nature is pretty gnarly. It can throw some really crazy, very toxic things at us, like mold, if we don't build our buildings correctly. I think it's also worth asking, why do we risk lives for risky insulation? The health risks are significant, but also the failure risk after installation is also significant. So why are we doing this? And the answer probably is marketing. It's why we're doing this. But I think we should question this. It's becoming more and more convenient and easy to figure out how to do better building, how to build truly good building. Living Future, Architecture 2030, they've been doing some amazing work in this space. The red list is something I definitely recommend familiarizing yourself with. You can go to livingfuture.org and find the red list very easily, or just Google Living Future red list. And there's a great webpage that explains this in detail, but effectively, these are the ingredients that you really need to avoid. And there's many, many more ingredients. So getting yourself deeply familiar with this is not probably realistic. Becoming conversationally familiar with it is very important. And reading the labels. As also part of the Living Future Institute, there's a declare label, which is like a nutrition label for a building product and explains what's in there. So you can identify quickly, is there anything red list in here or not? And has this convenient little, box that gets checked that says it's red list free. So you know that it's up to date, et cetera, et cetera. This is a voluntary system. I feel like it would be wonderful if it was mandatory, but voluntary is probably realistic. So another step, another very important thing is making construction comfortable, and not just for the occupants after people have moved in, but trying to make construction as comfortable as possible for all the various trades who are going to be working their butts off to get the project done. Try to make the whole process as enjoyable, fun, easy to do as possible. Just, I'm not saying it's always feasible, but it's always worth thinking about it and putting the effort into it. So since you guys are all pretty advanced in this space, I thought I would do kind of the 501 level of comfort, which is a term called thermal diffusivity. Thermal diffusivity is a concept of having R value that also takes into account heat flux through the day. So you could think of it as like a time-dependent R value in a sense. This graph is showing how thermal diffusivity works. The top is showing the outdoor temperature, and the bottom is showing the indoor temperature throughout the day. You can see there's quite a bit of variability of outdoor temperature through the day, but the indoor temperature stays very steady until late in the day, and then it heats up a little bit and then it cools off again overnight. Especially in a hotter climate like where we live and in Tucson and where you guys live, especially during summers that are getting hotter and hotter, having insulation with good thermal diffusivity properties is extremely important because it allows us to do narrower buildings that are, better for urban infill when setbacks are an issue, et cetera, et cetera. We can get a lot more performance out of 1.5 inches, say, of wood fiber than 4 inches of foam. So we can give more square footage or whatnot. So having thinner exterior insulation is really valuable for a lot of reasons. And if that thinner insulation is also carbon storing and providing better comfort than the thicker insulation, that's a really good value proposition. So this is a chart of different thermal diffusivity properties for different types of insulation, showing wood fiber insulation has ideal properties, more or less, the ideal balance of density to R value. Foam insulation is about 3-4 times worse as far as thermal diffusivity is concerned. And interestingly enough, mineral wool is very bad in terms of thermal diffusivity properties. So think about that. If you put your hand on a rock in the sun, the rock's going to be really hot. If you put your hand on a wood stump in the sun, the wood stump's probably going to be cool until very late in the day. That's a good way to kind of think about and visualize thermal diffusivity. So applying this to a little experiment in my backyard here in Tucson, where we get really big temperature swings, I built a 2-inch box out of foam, which is R10, and there's 1.5 inch box out of wood fiber, which is R5.7. So the foam box in theory has about twice the performance of the wood fiber box. Then I put hygrothermal sensors into these. I left them in my backyard for a year. This was the most interesting week of data. Inside the wood fiber box, we had temperatures ranging from 53 degrees to about 90 degrees. So not necessarily ideal, but livable. Whereas in the foam box, which again is supposed to have twice the performance, we had 49 degrees to 115 degrees temperature swings inside the box. So looking at this together on one chart, you can see that the wood fiber at roughly half the rated R value provided about twice the performance. So that's that 3 to 4x performance thing. So it's a very, very interesting thing to think about, especially in climate zones that have big diurnal temperature swings, like say California Central Coast. Having high density exterior insulation can be extremely valuable. Now we'll get into really the meat of this, which is accounting for carbon. The first step, which we've been looking at for a while, in a sense incompletely, because we've kind of just stopped at efficiency and assumed efficiency means low carbon, which sometimes it does, but sometimes it really doesn't, because in areas like Seattle, where they have a nearly carbon neutral grid, the efficiency delivered doesn't actually save much carbon because there's almost 0 carbon per kilowatt hour on the grid. Efficiency is still important for a lot of reasons. Don't take this as any sort of anti-efficiency statement. I'm deeply pro-efficiency. But what I'm saying is we can't deliver efficiency with high carbon impact materials because then the numbers don't work out. We don't have time for those kind of paybacks. All right. So operational carbon calculation. First thing we want to think about is how many kilowatt hours per year, right? So we can have a predicted EUI. We can multiply that, by the number of square feet, come up with a predicted kilowatt hours per year. Then we need to figure out how much carbon there is, how many pounds of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour exists on the grid that our building is going to be connected to, because that varies broadly. In Tucson, as I mentioned, it's very high. It's about 2 pounds per kilowatt hour. In Seattle, it's about 0.1 pounds per kilowatt hour. It's about a 20 times difference. So that makes a really big difference in our life cycle carbon numbers. So we take that pounds of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, and now we can look at our actual operational carbon savings, or predicted operational carbon savings compared to a mainstream building or whatever, in terms of carbon. So when we're doing scientific analysis, it's critical we use common units. And we've talked about carbon in kilowatt hours and BTUs for a very long time, which is not the way we need to do it. Another little pro tip, limit fasteners. We found this out. Our carpenters were very enthusiastic with the staple gun we used to attach this insulation. And you can use 1 or 2 staples per board, and they went like 15 to 20 on a few boards. And there's significant thermal bridging through those kind of staples. So just a little thing I had to throw in there. So we've been in this thing I like to call the efficiency trap, which, since we're on a tight timeline, I'll go through very quickly. But effectively, it's that bad building's not working out. We need to do good building. This is like the start of this in, say, the 1970s. And everyone's like, oh, buildings need to be healthy, comfortable, affordable, low carbon, durable, socially equitable. There's a lot of great goals to start. Then we said, okay, but good needs to be quantified and green might be too political. So let's talk about this as energy efficiency. And people say, cool, solid plan. All right, how do we do this? So we decided to maximize efficiency and collect data focused on proving efficiency delivered efficiently, and that we've made people more efficient. We became very obsessed with efficiency, right? And there's a certain group of voices saying, oh, but that's not really the goal. Don't worry, we're going to sneak in the green. Efficiency will make it happen. So now efficiency really caught on. We have certification systems for efficiency. That's really wonderful. And now Passive House has basically perfected efficiency, and the world's saved. And snap. It turns out high performance just amplifies things. It looks nice in energy models, but bad high performance is actually the worst building yet, as far as failure risk, as far as health risk, as far as life cycle carbon impact. If you use a lot more bad insulation to achieve efficiency, that turns out not to be a great outcome in most cases. So what about all these original goals, right? Efficiency was not the goal, is our market-driven excuse for capitalist culture. Efficiency is neither bad nor good, it's just efficient. You can efficiently do bad things, right? Efficiency is more of the adjective for what we need to achieve. So, looking at the carbon life cycle of buildings. Luckily nowadays, we're able to take a really deep look at these, a much more complete look. There's a way to go on precision, but the analysis over decades of people researching and looking at these things for carbon life cycles of buildings, the numbers are now accurate enough to do very meaningful analysis. So the little red circle here is our operational use of a building. The rest of it is the life cycle carbon impact. The first part, which is the focus that I'll be talking about a little bit today, and I'm borrowing the slide from another presentation I did on a deep dive on embodied carbon, is material carbon emissions. These are the upfront embodied carbon emissions built into the product itself. Project teams need to consider these parts of carbon. What is the transportation carbon impact? When we're installing it, is there a way we can charge our batteries on solar or something, right? How can we reduce the carbon impact of installing the materials? And then why durability is so mission critical is that we need to push off this end of life cycle carbon impact as long as possible, so that the carbon storage we put into buildings lasts as long as possible. So material embodied carbon, that upfront embodied carbon built into the material itself, literally the only way you can control this is through your product specification, right? That typically represents 70 to 80% of life cycle emissions of a building. So if we want to do low carbon building, the way we need to do it is through our product specifications, far more so than our energy efficiency specifications. The ultimate goal is to do an energy efficient building built with good materials that are low carbon. That's the ultimate way to do it. but we can't sacrifice good materials to deliver efficiency. That turns out not to work out from a carbon number standpoint. So insulation tends to be the thing that's easiest to change. So if you're looking for a first thing to dig into, insulation is what I definitely recommend. These slides will be available, and you can look at this presentation later to refer to these and follow up with me if you want a copy of them as well. This is a breakdown of kind of an average building in near Toronto, Canada, done by that same guy, Chris Magwood, I mentioned earlier. But I use it to highlight that insulation is a very significant chunk of the building, and it can actually be closer to 50% at times. And there's been a lot of research, a lot of work done there. And with insulation, we have the opportunity to go from extremely high carbon impact insulations like spray foam and such to net carbon storing insulation like wool, cellulose, cork, wood fiber, hempcrete, straw bale. These things actually store carbon up front. This is the secret weapon in fighting the climate crisis through the built environment, is carbon storing insulation. So to illustrate that materials matter, I'm going to show some results from what's this new tool that's coming out that I recommend everyone download and learn how to use, or hire someone to do it for them. It's called Beam. It's a residential scale carbon calculator that's, again, free to use, free to download through Builders for Climate Change, or Climate Action. Climate Change would be a bad name. Builders for Climate Action is an organization in the Northeast and in Canada that has been working together to create this tool so that we can actually look at upfront carbon emissions in buildings more completely. So from some analysis they did on buildings near Toronto, they looked at a high performance building using high carbon impact materials and found very high carbon impact. Then they used a typical code built building with high carbon impact material or average carbon impact materials. And it turned out the code built building with lower carbon materials was significantly, like basically a third of the carbon of the high performance building with high carbon impact buildings or materials. The building that used carbon storing materials and low carbon materials and met local code was actually net carbon storing up front. So a code built building using the right materials was carbon storing up front. That's something that should be very kind of like, oh my God, really? And then if you do a high performance building with materials that are optimized for carbon storage, you can get very deep levels of carbon storage up front in the building and start working from there. So what does this look like over time? The little question mark that you see there is the upfront embodied carbon. That's the amount that's going to vary. The operational carbon is going to stay roughly the same in this analysis, right? So if we have high embodied carbon materials up front, it's like building in 315 years of operational carbon impact up front. That building, even though it's a passive house, is never going to have a meaningful impact on carbon saving overall. This is a code built building with average materials, still not good, but counterintuitively far lower impact than the passive house built with high carbon materials. So 71 years of operational carbon. Now we take a conventional building built with low carbon impact and carbon storing materials, and it's net carbon storing for 45 years. Now we do a passive house with carbon storing materials, and we have a building that's net carbon storing for 190 years. So the materials, the ingredients are what creates the result. The efficiency matters, but the ingredients are what creates the result. So looking at this in one chart, this is a high carbon, low efficiency building. So this is high carbon impact conventional building. This is high carbon impact passive house. So still not very good. This is mid carbon, low efficiency, right? So low efficiency being code built building, mid carbon impact materials. This is passive house with mid carbon impact materials. And I'm using passive house as a proxy for most efficient building. This is code built with carbon storing materials. This is passive house with low carbon materials, and this is passive house with carbon optimized materials, right? So as I've started saying recently, the material carbon emissions are greater than the energy efficiency in terms of carbon impact. Again, efficiency still matters. We should still do efficient buildings if we can. But from a carbon standpoint, the upfront carbon is far more efficiency than the operational carbon at this point. So to be saving our future, what we need to do is mandate that we use low carbon impact or carbon storing materials. To learn a lot more about this and sign up so you are aware of this beam tool, it's going to be launching at the end of this month or early next month. You can go to buildersforclimateaction.org. It's an amazing organization. This is a slide I'm borrowing from an education session we did for the Northwest Eco Building Guild on the note of tying our efforts together and stuff. There's a recording I did about the beam presentation that I can share with your organizations or with you as individuals if you're interested to learn a little bit more about this tool and how it's used. Just to let you know, there's a lot of people very busily working right now to add all these features to the tool. And it's coming soon for free, again, targeting end of this month or early April, with some training programs and stuff available by summer. So another really important step to take is that we need to limit embodied injustice. So by that, I mean structural violence against people built into both the installation of the product, but also the manufacturing of the product. So how is it harvested? Is that requiring people to go, survive wars to get an ingredient for it? Are some of the ingredients being made in factories that are polluting rivers and entire ecosystems, right? We need to ask these questions because that impact can't be removed from the product through our design. And carbon isn't just up front, by which I mean it's not just embodied, it's also operational, but it's also not socially just. Carbon impact is going to hurt the most vulnerable people. And it should be viewed as kind of our duty to try to do what we can with whatever privilege we may have to try to solve that. And it's long past time to tell this story. I don't think it's okay for people to dress up like they're fighting an outbreak to install insulation. If you're using healthy natural products, it turns out that this is how you need to dress to install them. It's a lot more enjoyable. You don't go home at the end of the day with a headache because of all the fumes. I like to break this down, kind of cheesy, but a tale of two insulation approaches. There's our worst of times approach, foam, mineral wool, fiberglass. These materials in their product extraction and manufacturing cycles require ripping apart dominating natural world, leading to suffering through displacement and economic hardship. Workers are exposed to extreme toxicity, poor working conditions, and low wages during manufacturing and installation. And occupants then have risk of suffering from mold, moisture failures, and sick building syndrome. Not a great life cycle. Best of times, say wood fiber, cork, and wool, that's produced in harmony with nature to sustain natural environments that improve life. So at least it can be. It isn't always. You still need to, you can't just trust wool and wood are good. Cork is good. You need to make sure that it is actually being made well from good sources. Workers can have healthy working environments and better paying jobs. And occupants can then enjoy healthy, durable, and comfortable spaces. And I'll summarize it in this way. One of our biggest problems is not just the product itself, but that we so often in this industry will say, that work sucks, let the fill in the blank less privileged person do it, right? So often we're specifying something because it sounds really cool, but when we're not actually the person out there installing it and we're separated from the actual life cycle of that product. So I suggest when you specify things, go experience the installation of them as much as you can and really dig into it as much as you can. And then we need to build for good. We need to build for good outcomes, but also try to make our buildings last as long as possible. Unfortunately, we're looking at a more and more fiery future. And I'm not going to go deep into these things because these are very complex subjects that I have whole presentations dedicated to. If you're interested in seeing those, you can reach out to me. But effectively, from a basic core principles standpoint, high pressure moves to low pressure. The sun is basically a big ball of fire energy far away, and forest fires are relatively small, but they're a lot closer, right? So on a hot day, when it's say 95 degrees outside, if you're in a leaky building like this cabin and it's a little cooler inside, hot moves to cold. So it's going to get a lot hotter inside this cabin. Up there is the first passive house, and it'll say to heat through having a lot of insulation and very little air leakage, say, you shall not pass to heat, right? Turns out the same dynamic works out similarly in wildfire scenarios where the hyperheated air, which is about, say 1,500 to thousands of degrees, is then also able to find its way through those same air leakage pathways, but it's a much bigger pressure difference because instead of like 95 degrees to 72 degrees from outside to inside, you're at say 3,000 degrees outside to 72 degrees inside. And that hyperheated air is then much more easily able to get into the building through those pathways and combust things on the way in. So increasing air tightness in a very specific way is actually a key component of being more fire resistant. As an example of this, big shout out to Carmel Building and Design, Mike Corrigan, and other folks who have worked on this, borrowing these slides from Passive House, California. There's a project I got to work on back in the day when I was still at 475. I ended up helping specify the products for this and sold them to them. What we were really concerned about was fire. And what we wanted to do is build a carbon storing building. So we were using cellulose, Gutex wood fiber insulation, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, there was a chance, which is very rare, for a building science hypothesis to be tested in reality. The neighborhood burned down, tragically, obviously. And the passive house ended up being just fine, despite the rest of the neighborhood around it burning down. And the reason, one of the reasons, they had proper site protection and everything, but from a building enclosure standpoint, the reason it was more fire resistant is there was a durable air barrier installed to passive house or tighter. It was protected, that air barrier itself was protected by high thermal mass insulation, and then that high thermal mass insulation was then protected by ember-proof cladding and roofing, right? We also need to make sure on the other end of the spectrum that we build to flow with water. And I'm not going to go deep into this at all, but the short thing to remember is that you can't beat nature. Buildings are going to get wet at some point somehow. What we need to do is make sure the drying potential of our buildings is greater than the expected wetting, and then we can have safe performance. I put the photo in the back. This is another one of our projects in Phoenix. It's a single-story building where we did 45-degree ventilation battens. There's a lot of reasons that that's not a great idea, especially in colder climates. In Phoenix, this is just an area to let water vapor or liquid water become vapor so it can dry out and have a direction to go. There's enough pressure difference built up there for this to work on a single-story building. But for our buildings that are 2 stories, we're actually doing a full 1.5 inch ventilation channel with 2x4s on their side, spanning the whole length of the building for both a thermal separation of cladding, as well as letting sufficient airflow build up. There's limits to this, but basically the higher the channel, the longer the channel, so 2 stories, much more than 1 story, right? The deeper the ventilation channel should be for drying. And the other general rule I'll say is that vapor closed materials are almost always risky. Try to use vapor permeable materials wherever you can, and or hire a building scientist to do this kind of analysis for you, because it's very, very important to understand drying dynamics in your climate and how to minimize wetting but maximize drying. So the other thing too to note is that models are often the best way to justify bad decisions. That's become one of my sayings. Models are incredibly useful for verifying claims, for starting conversations, but in general, I don't think models should be the end of a conversation. I think they should be the start of a conversation, especially when it comes to drying dynamics in buildings, because there are a lot of factors that influence the wetting and drying of a building. Another key rule to really mention is that all leaks are not created equal. And the general trend we're on actually is towards higher risk of moisture failures because we're tightening up our buildings and making leakage pathways smaller and longer. And the smaller and longer the leakage pathway, the more moisture failure risk exists. You can illustrate this by blowing on a cold window. If you blow on it softly, a lot of moisture builds up. If you blow on the window really hard, almost no moisture builds up, right? So long, slow air leakage pathways are higher moisture risk. They leave more wetting and they create less drying. So as we move towards higher and higher performance buildings with more insulation, more air tightness, we need to be more and more careful about limiting moisture failures. Checking on time. All right, I'm going to start towards wrapping this up here so we can get to Q&A. Again, the 5 factors of good building, just to show you. I would suggest that we need to demand good building. To me, it's critical for the future of humanity. Nature is going to be just fine without us, but we're looking at a really rocky path moving forward. And this isn't about high performance versus low performance. Again, both are fine as long as we use the right ingredients. Like top chefs will create amazing results by requiring good ingredients as the core of our work. And we can start by crunching the carbon numbers, but we also must consider the other factors of each specification, as I was just talking about. This is my older daughter. I want people to react to standard specifications like Tyvek and being like, really, that's just so lazy. Can we look into something else? Can we try harder on our building wrap? It's a very important thing. It's not just building wrap. Building wrap is arguably your most important performance layer. And then when someone suggests foam insulation, I want it to look like my business partner's kid when he's asked for vegetables. I want you to give a skeptical look and just think about it, right? Just try to push back against the standard specifications, the mainstream specifications. Because are we going to answer this next generation with less bad or more good? We're out of time for less bad. Less bad is not very inspirational to me. I think we need to demand more good. And every year, those of us in the low-rise building sector, we build around 2.5 billion square feet of housing. We can make that housing, all of our efforts, we can make those climate positive by getting our product specifications right. And this is a really good deal because the materials with the lowest carbon footprint, they also tend to have the lowest impacts in all the other categories that matter, like ozone depletion, eutrophication, acidification, photochemical ozone creation, depletion of abiotic resources, depletion of fossil fuels, waste, occupant health and safety. All of those things can be solved with product specifications. This is a napkin that someone from EMU Building Systems found. And it says, our greatest fear should not be failure, but of succeeding at something that doesn't really matter. And with Valley, with our approach, we've been saying we need to build for good. We want to make our work matter, right? That's what we're really going for. It's sometimes a tough pill to swallow to look at work you've done and admit you've made mistakes. I admit I've made tons of mistakes, but congratulations if you have, because then you've participated in the scientific process of improving the world. We need to make mistakes. We need to start with a hypothesis, try it out, collect data, but then if it doesn't work, get better, right? The world's also very stressful. So I included this photo of a saguaro cactus nearby my house with it looked like to me with its hand on the friend saying, we'll be okay, right? And I think all of us working together, all of us having, the professional skill sets that we do through collaboration and understanding this stuff, I really do think there's a chance, but our window for making effective action is closing quickly. So with that, I'll wrap it up and we can move to Q&A. I'm not sure how that's going to be facilitated, but let's do it.
Maybe if you put the questions into the chat, I can try to organize them.
And I'll stop share so we can all see each other.
Okay, here's a question, Lucas. What's your recommended insulation for a non-vented roof assembly? I don't know, a way to avoid using spray foam.
Great. So as long as you have continuous exterior insulation, typically meeting R10, sometimes R5, on the exterior of sheathing, you can avoid using foam in the building. It's in IBC as well as California code. It's one of the code approved assembly systems, but you generally also need to have a vapor permeable insulation in the roof cavity below, and that needs to be protected by a class 2 vapor retarder or better. Typically I've used either Proclima's Intello Plus membrane, which is vapor variable and airtight, or Partel's Vara Plus membrane is a good alternative to that. Both vapor variable membrane systems that are airtight, red list free, et cetera, put say dense pack cellulose or sheep wool above that. And on the exterior roof, you could use wood fiber insulation, cork insulation. We're looking into T-stud Larson trusses. If you've seen those T-studs, the thermally broken bare naked T-stud, I like those as conceptually as a Larson truss effectively, and then put a netting and dense pack there. So there's a lot of approaches to doing this, but typically it requires putting continuous exterior insulation on the outside of the roof sheathing. There are also a good number of examples of people getting code exemptions when using a vapor variable membrane on the interior side. So it's just vapor variable air tightness membrane, cellulose or wool, sheathing, and roof system. That's a riskier assembly because now you have one membrane that's both blocking wetting as well as facilitating drying with a vapor closed exterior. So yeah, roofs are very complicated. One thing in general is try to avoid flat roofs and give yourself at least a 312 pitch. That opens up a lot more good options. Flat roofs are going to make it very hard to avoid high carbon impact materials.
So your dense pack cellulose was the vapor permeable insulation you'd put in a, say, vaulted ceiling or something like that.
Or Havelock wool. They have bats and a loose fill. That's also a really good option for a healthy carbon storing product. Hemp wool. There's also hemp wool bats, which are really neat. I haven't actually gotten to install those on a project myself yet, but we're trying to figure out the right place to try those out. So there's a lot of really neat stuff happening, and the wood fiber products are going to be made in the US in the next few years. So there's a lot of really, really cool things happening. And just a thing I forgot to mention earlier on this note is there's a perception, and it's a very strong misperception, that these natural products are some new experimental hippy dippy thing. Gutex, for instance, in Germany has been doing this for over 90 years. They've been doing this before foam insulation was a thing, right? It's not low tech. These are high tech natural products. They go through incredibly sophisticated manufacturing processes. It's just there's good ingredients being put into that manufacturing process instead of a bunch of chemicals.
Okay, how about the difference between mineral wool versus wool insulation?
Yeah, so mineral wool is effectively synthetic sheep wool. Those are the properties it's trying to imitate in a lot of ways. Sheep wool is literally a miraculous fiber from a performance standpoint. The way I'd summarize that, I suppose, is Mother Nature is our greatest scientist. She's had billions of years of real world experimentation to perfect things. And sheep wool has evolved over that time to be able to perform very well in nature. Mineral wool is something that was perfected in laboratories to use leftover rock slag and other chemicals and stuff to create an insulation product, which is a great intent. It's a great idea, but the ingredients create the results. And if your input is rock slag versus sheep wool from happy sheep, like that's not a good core ingredient. So that's the real difference. And then from a performance standpoint, we do use mineral wool occasionally. It's a really great thing for creating like a thermal break below grade, if you want to avoid foam below grade or something like that. There are some applications, but in general, natural fibers. Here's another way to think about it. Performance occurs on the microscopic scale. Fibers look really different at a microscopic scale. Google sheep wool fiber versus wood fiber versus fiberglass fiber versus rock wool fiber, mineral wool fiber. Fiberglass fibers, mineral fibers, they look like fishing thread, right? They're very boring fibers. Wood fibers and sheep wool look extremely complex because they are, right? Performance happens at that scale. That's what air and water vapor and stuff are looking at, that's what they're experiencing, is that microscopic scale. So we see them as, oh, they're just fibers, they're just insulation, but they're fundamentally different things.
So here's another question. How much should we be focusing on EPDs and requiring them for all products? And maybe can you talk a little bit about what the current trends you see happening regarding those declarations?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Because it is something I also forgot to mention. If you want to like a single thing you can sink your teeth into activism wise in regards to this kind of stuff, demand EPDs. It doesn't mean a product's good if they have an EPD. A lot of the very high carbon numbers I was showing you are from like foam EPDs that are officially from the manufacturer. So don't just assume it's a good product because they have an EPD. That's definitely not true. But having all products have EPDs is a game changer because it gives us the core data set we need to make better decisions. So always ask, is there an EPD? I don't know if you've ever seen one or read an EPD. To the person who asked the question, they're not very well done as far as digestibility is concerned. They're very odd technical documents in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of tools now available, like the Beam tool I was mentioning, or EC3, which is a tool developed by Skanksa and Microsoft and a coalition of people near Seattle for kind of bigger buildings. And it's a group they're putting together called Building Transparency. And their goal is to put together, I guess, the world's largest database of EPDs. It's open source, so we can all draw for them. So basically, that's a very long-winded way, as I'm sure you're used to me being by now, of saying demand EPDs.
I noticed that UL is starting to show up at green building conferences, and they're looking to standardize the format for those because they kind of cornered the market on fire resistant declarations. And so they're starting to think about the product declarations as well, to standardize that and have it in their books and sell it to people. So it's kind of an interesting field. I wanted to ask you a question about which software do you use to generate your embodied carbon calculations? You mentioned it, but it was so fast. I didn't know.
Oh yeah, sorry. So BEAM, the one through Builders for Climate Action, BEAM, it's Building Emissions Accounting for Materials is what it stands for. And it's a really genius approach in that it is done in accounting language. So in my beta testing of this product, developers who are usually sitting back like this at meetings, looking at their phone or whatever, have been pulling this report out of people's hands and reading it, digesting it, and asking, how do you get to zero? Because it's in the language they're used to looking at, right? It's been, so I thought it would be powerful, but it's been game changing, this BEAM tool in particular. For bigger buildings, bigger developments, EC3, again, is the tool, and it's buildingtransparency.org. Is a really, really wonderful organization. And the other thing that people should definitely check out is the 2030 materials palette. It's the Carbon Smart Materials Palette is the whole name. That's a really great like 101 level resource to check out if you're new to embodied carbon, or share with clients if you're trying to introduce them. It's a really great starting point.
So we have one more question, maybe, because we're right at 1 o'clock.
Oh, yes.
Is there a resource to find various assembly details incorporating continuous wood fiber, Class A roof assemblies, fire ratings, exterior finishes, a flat roof, 2% minimum slope with single ply roofing applied to reduce the carbon footprint? So what's a resource to find the details for all those assemblies?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to find in general. I mean, a lot of, through the Northwest Eco Building Guild, we put on a lot of trainings and stuff, and it's usually found in presentations, honestly, through a lot of Google searching. The other thing is when I left 475 High Performance Building Supply, when I was working there as their Western Regional Manager, and I helped create the Smart Enclosure System ebooks, which are pretty darn extensive. And they show endless different types of assembly systems, from double stud to standard 2x framing to masonry to whatever you could imagine, mass timber. There's different ebooks for different solutions. They are all, of course, 475 products. But even not working there anymore, I still do stand by that that's a collection of some of the best products on the planet. So the Smart Enclosure ebooks are definitely going to steer you right. There are viable product substitutions for some of the details, some of them not. This stuff gets extremely complicated. And Small Planet Supply is another group I've worked with a lot. They've, I think, partnered with Hayward Lumber. They, both Small Planet and 475 will spend a lot of time on the phone with you, helping out with enclosure details. It's also what we do professionally. So if you guys need like a really more formal approach to enclosure specification and whatnot, that's some of the consulting work we often do.
I think we're going to hit you up for another webinar, either through AIA Santa Barbara or CCGBC, to go over some building detailing for typical enclosures, because
Sure.
Your breadth of knowledge from working at 475 and other places, even Allen Associates, gives you a unique rough brush overview of how we should be dealing with humidity and moisture and permeable membranes and all that kind of stuff. So thank you so much.
Of course.
Lucas, you're uniquely qualified. We had a question for Tara, where this recording will be available for rebroadcast, I guess, if they want to give it to a friend or something.
Yes, we are recording and we'll be posting it on our website and through the newsletter. So you can look out for that in the near future. Just a few.
The other kind of thing I wanted to mention real quick is California. I'm on the AIA California Committee on the Environment, and in advocacy, they're starting to look at requirements for embodied carbon minimum for concrete and embodied carbon standards for building materials to be allowed in the state of California, like we have for the off-gassing of paints and adhesives and things like that, to start just making it standard practice for many of these elements that are used in California for construction, so that we can lower the embodied carbon in the standard construction that's going to be going on in California. So thank you again so much, Lucas. Give a spiel, give your phone number so people can call you as a consultant. I could think of about 10 jobs I need to call you on. I don't know if I can afford you. That's the only problem.
No, we try to keep, I mean, honestly, one of the things we try to do is keep it as low touch as possible. Like, especially if you have some degree of expertise, it can be pretty darn efficient. So it's usually on the order of a couple grand kind of thing. It's usually, unless we're getting really involved on a project, we try to get key information out there, but we're not trying to blow anyone's budgets, because otherwise people won't do it. As
So
much as I wish.
You're with Valley Homes in Tucson, Arizona?
Yeah, well, we're technically located in Phoenix. I'm in Tucson, so I guess we have two headquarters, even though it's just two of us running the company. Yeah, with two divisions. Divisions and headquarters feel like very strong words, considering it's me and my business partner, but we get a lot done regardless. I'm also, if we want to like end the recording and people have other questions, I have a little bit more time available at the moment. So if people want to ask them, I'm happy. There's a couple technical assembly questions that I'm excited about.
Let's keep the recording going. And if people need to leave, sorry about that, but anyone else is welcome to stay for a few more minutes.
Sure,
Okay.
that sounds like a
We
great
had
approach.
a question about alternatives for under slab cold climate insulation.
Ooh, yeah. That's an interesting one. I mean, there's the expanded glass products, like Glavel is an example. Weird brand name. It sounds like a disease you'd pick up in Germany or something, like Glavel. But it's really nice that it's foam free, but it is also and it's really great that it gives recycled glass a useful source to go to in the end. But for as far as embodied carbon is concerned, it's about the same as EPS. So for sub-slab insulation, we actually don't use any in our climate because we're trying to keep the slab connected to the relatively cool soil, but we do perimeter insulation, and that's EPS for sure. Instead of XPS. XPS can be 5 to 10 times the carbon impact per cubic foot. So the pink and blue stuff can be very, very, very high carbon impact per cubic foot at about the same level of spray foam. Whereas the EPS is roughly mineral wool, roughly, foam glass. Those are all around the same, around 5 pounds per cubic foot to give a number. I saw another question about recommendations on a commercial building with a flat roof, 2% min slope, single ply roofing assembly, reduced carbon footprint. Yeah, that is a tough one. That's a really, really tough one. There's honestly not too much you can do on the exterior that doesn't require some very crazy buildup stuff with 3 or 4 different layers and ventilation battens and stuff. What you'd probably want to do is focus on using a deeply carbon storing insulation in the rafter or joist bays below that. So if you look at the roof as a whole system, the carbon storage of the say 12 inches of cellulose could offset a good chunk of the carbon impact of EPDM roofing or whatever the heck is put down in the end. So looking at it as a whole system. And that's why having this beam tool available soon is so exciting, because it allows us to do that. Like, oh, what if we use this roof type and this insulation type? What are those numbers actually, right? It's game changing to have that analysis ability.
Yeah, I think this is a whole nother area where architects need to up our literacy so that we can help explain it to our clients. So we need the tools to be able to quantify it, to be able to show some numbers like you did for the different types of insulation so that it starts making some sense. And you can make an informed decision about how to put the building together as opposed to just shoot from the hip and not having much in the way of factual information to back it up. I was reading an interesting article this morning about a bunch of buildings that they're planning on tearing down in New York City that are around the train station to build like some kind of a new mega eco super environmental commercial district, I think in downtown New York. And people are battling because the historic preservationists want to save the buildings. And then there are environmentalists who are saying, well, what about the embodied carbon that's in all of those structures? They should be preserved. And the preservation of the embodied carbon goes hand in hand with historical preservation. I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that.
That's absolutely true. I mean, it's really interesting when you get into retrofits with this kind of analysis, because it's almost impossible to accurately value the embodied carbon value of what's already there, the existing structure, as a starting point. So in a sense, the retrofit measures that you're putting onto the building are the carbon impact of what you're doing. So it becomes even counterintuitively, in a sense, it becomes even more important to use carbon storing materials when you're doing retrofits. But without a doubt, from a life cycle standpoint, if a building is already there, if you can figure out a way to extend the life of that building instead of tearing it down and building something new, I don't care what you build after you tear it down, how carbon storing it is, et cetera, it's pretty unlikely you're going to have meaningful carbon storing within 20 years, within, certain parameters. If we're talking like condemned shack on a nice property and, it takes half a day to tear it down and get it off the property, and you build a carbon storing passive house, okay, fine, that works out numbers wise. But taking my house that I live in here and tearing it down and building something new it'd be almost impossible to have those numbers work out. So instead, a lot of what we're focused on here in Arizona, where yards are quite big, is just helping people do a backyard cottage or a backyard office, because distributed work seems like part of the future. Having the ability to stay in their existing home instead of building something bigger is also a massive part of life cycle carbon impact. And making projects beautiful and enjoyable is important too, because if you build a carbon storing building that people hate, they're either going to sell it or tear it down and build something else. So all of it's really important. Like everything we know about making buildings durable still needs to be applied. Everything we know about efficiency still needs to be applied, right? All of it still needs to be applied. We just need to add embodied carbon calculation into the mix, and view each decision more holistically. There's not just efficiency measures. Everything is a whole building impact measure until it's, until you've proven otherwise. Like you might be able to argue that like countertop isn't, but in some ways it is.
Yep.
So
I think we made it through all the questions. I guess last call on questions, if anybody has any. But I'd like to thank you again, Lucas, for sharing your knowledge with us. And, someday when you make it big, you can move on back. Start doing some super green homes over here.
There you go.
In the nice warm 70-degree sunshine.
Oh, I miss surfing tremendously. That's the big one, man. I really miss surfing.
Yeah.
Not a lot of surf in Tucson, it turns out.
Great to connect with you again and see you. And thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Hopefully, it'll get us interested in this sort of thing. And I'm serious about getting you back to do some kind of passive house detailing on typical residential details, maybe some commercial details on how we could be doing stuff. There's so much new technology coming out with the Gutex and like the zip ply, the plywood that has the membrane already pre-manufactured onto one side of it, and all those crazy embodied the phase change material that was floating around a couple of years ago. I don't know what happened to that stuff or what it's made of, but we can look at all those things and kind of get some best practices together. It'd be awesome.
Fantastic. Yeah, that'd be really fun. Enclosure systems is my deepest level of passion amongst all of this stuff. So
yeah.
Awesome,
man. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks for hanging out, all of you people.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending today. It's been really great to see some people again and connect with new people as well. So thank you for having me.
All right. Well, take care.
All right. Bye now.
See ya.